Hello, how are you? Today I'm going to tell you about the carbohydrate that many people consume daily in various foods without even realizing it. And it's actually even worse than refined white sugar, the table sugar, right? The one we sometimes use to sweeten our coffee, add to juice, or to make a cake or some everyday recipe. There's a carbohydrate that's actually even worse for it, for our body, for our liver, for our metabolism, and for weight gain. You need to know what it is, so stick around until the end. You won't want to miss this. Before we get started, I want to ask you if you have the habit of adding sugar to your daily meals. If you've been trying to cut out refined sugar from your diet, if you don't consume sugar but use some sugar substitute, some natural sweetener, or another product to sweeten things, or if you're trying to sweeten with fruit itself or more natural foods. Write to me down below because I'd love to know what your relationship with sugar is. And remember, I have a really cool video here showing what happens to our bodies when we go 30 days without consuming sugar. It truly brings benefits, many impactful benefits for our health and our metabolism. You're going to love watching this video. I'll leave the link for it down below in the description. Of course, we already know that white sugar, refined sugar, the table sugar we call it, right? It brings a lot of harm to our health. We know it increases weight gain. It's a calorie completely empty, right? It has no vitamins, no minerals, no antioxidants, no fiber. It's a food that's absorbed very, very, very quickly. So it raises blood sugar levels abruptly, which causes an increase in insulin in our body, which can lead to insulin resistance and can lead to fat accumulation in the visceral central abdominal region. So after talking about all these harms of white sugar, you might be wondering, how can there be a carbohydrate that's even worse than white sugar? And in fact, there is. It's fructose, but not the fructose from fruit. I'll explain the difference to you later. It's the fructose that's found in processed foods and often appears as fructose syrup or just fructose on the label. It's really important for us to know how to read food labels to identify when fructose is present. I have a video here on the channel that talks more about how to properly interpret food labels, and I'll leave it down below in the description for you. But fructose has a component that can cause a lot of harm to our health, affecting different parts of our body and various organs to different degrees. Let's talk more about that. The big issue with fructose is that when it's consumed in excess, in large amounts, which is what happens when you get it from processed foods, what actually happens? It gets metabolized in your liver, and part of it is converted into glycogen to store energy there. And part of it, since obviously you can't store that much glycogen in your body, will be quickly converted into fat. And often this fat ends up accumulating precisely in the visceral central abdominal region, near the liver, around the liver. That's why people who consume a lot of fructose from processed sources have a connection with fatty liver with hepatic steatosis. Tell me if you have fatty liver, if you've ever been diagnosed with hepatic steatosis. What was the degree? And do you have a strong habit of consuming processed foods? Write it for me down here in the comments. So when fructose is actually converted into fat, it causes this fat to be preferentially stored, accumulated in this visceral central abdominal region. And we already know that accumulation in this area isn't just bad for the liver. This can lead to insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, a greater predisposition to developing type 2 diabetes, and it can also be related to other health conditions such as cardiovascular issues and hypertension. So excessive consumption of fructose can really be harmful to various organs and systems in our body. In fact, some scientific studies have already observed the high consumption, right? The relationship between high fructose intake and insulin resistance. So this is a very important finding because, in fact, it is a type of carbohydrate that affects carbohydrate metabolism, the metabolism of sugars in our body. It's not just harmful on its own, but it also makes insulin less effective, causing the cells to become more resistant to recognizing insulin, making it harder for insulin to do its job. As a result, even other carbohydrates you consume, which aren't fructose, will be affected by this deficiency in insulin optimization. This is a very important point. It's also worth emphasizing that this accumulation of fructose in our body, this high intake of fructose, can also worsen cardiovascular health, as I mentioned to you. It can increase the amount of triglycerides in our body, which are certainly always closely related to the amount of carbohydrates we consume, especially simple ones, particularly those with a high glycemic index. So it will probably increase the amount of triglycerides in people who consume diets rich in fructose. This will worsen cardiovascular health and can also increase your chances of having higher cholesterol and higher levels of bad cholesterol as well. Another very important point regarding fructose is that it does not act on our brain in the same way as glucose does. It ends up not being able to stimulate the satiety centers as much as regular sugar does. It does stimulate them, of course, but it's not a super satiating substance. We know that, right? But it can actually be worse than white sugar. So often you end up consuming more fructose than you would pure glucose because of this issue. It really isn't as satiating as other types of carbohydrates. And if we compare it to low glycemic index carbohydrates, with fiber, with protein, the feeling of satiety is even better. Another very important point to mention is that what actually harms us is the fructose found in processed foods, and often it's present in surprisingly high amounts, hidden in products you'd never even think contain it. For example, a sauce that's slightly sweet but still savory, or sweet and sour, might have fructose added instead of regular sugar. That happens mainly because fructose helps increase the product's shelf life and also reduces industrial costs, making it a common choice in many packaged foods we eat without realizing it. So even some bakery or pastry products, sometimes they use fructose to make it more glazed, to make it shinier. Besides, obviously, cookies, cakes, and other sweet processed foods. So the most important thing, if you want to reduce your fructose intake, is to always read food labels and check if it's listed among the main ingredients. We know that food labels list ingredients in descending order, where the ingredient that appears first is the one present in the greatest amount. So if fructose is one of the first ingredients, that's already a reason for you to be quite concerned and turn on a warning light. Of course, the ideal would be for you to consume products that don't contain fructose at all. So if you can still choose that option, it will be better for your health in a broader sense. It's always important to mention that when we talk about the fructose that's really bad for us, we're referring to industrialized fructose. Of course, fruits contain fructose in a natural form, and fruits also contain glucose. But fruits also have fiber, antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, and the amount of fructose present in fruit doesn't even compare to something like a filled snack cake, for example. The amount of carbohydrates is infinitely lower, and because they contain fiber, they are absorbed more slowly, or even fat or protein, depending on the type of fruit you eat. So let's not start scaring people about eating fruit, because if the fruit is consumed fresh, that's an important point, right? Not candied fruits, dried fruits, or concentrated fruit juices, those can indeed have more fructose because they're more concentrated, and in the case of juices, the fiber is often removed, which affects the rate of absorption. But if you think about a banana, a pear, an apple, a watermelon, or a melon, even though they contain fructose, and depending on their ripeness, the ratio of fructose to glucose changes in the fruit, that doesn't make them a food to be avoided. On the contrary, as long as you consume reasonable and normal amounts of fruit throughout your day. And always, of course, if you can, it's better for you. It's a good idea to pair your fruits with foods rich in fiber, protein, or healthy fats, such as nuts, flaxseed, chia seeds, yogurt, milk to make a smoothie, oats, or other ingredients that will further complement your meal by increasing satiety and improving the glycemic index. Remember that I have a specific video where I talk more about the fructose found in processed foods versus fruits, if you want more information about this difference. I also have videos here that go into more detail about the glycemic index, which is super important to understand as this concept is related to the speed at which carbohydrates are absorbed, and that makes a big difference to our health. Knowing how to choose good sources of carbohydrates will help you, including with better blood sugar control if you are diabetic. Remember that I've put together some really great material with recipes, meal plans, and tips to help you control your blood sugar. I'll leave the link to this material below, along with 2 other resources, one to help control inflammation in the body, and another for healthier weight loss. So if you're interested in these topics, take a look at the description because I'll also leave the links to these materials there, okay? Were you surprised by this information about carbohydrates? Is this what you expected? Do you already take care to avoid consuming fructose in your daily life? And even with the foods you sometimes give to your children or the ones you buy to keep at home? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you like this topic, give the video a like, because that way I'll know you enjoyed it, and I'll bring more tips like these, things we sometimes overlook in our daily lives. And if you know someone who could benefit from this information, who needs to know about this, share this video. Let's expand this chain of goodness together, all right? Because that's what I want here with the channel. See you next time. Bye.